Hello, everybody. I'm joined here today by the wonderful and brilliant Daniel from OG Rose. Daniel is running a YouTube channel with, I believe, his wife as
Yes,
well.
yes.
Yes. And you are having this thing called OG Rose, and you are writing a lot of things. You're interested in literature and philosophy. So, first of all, I'd just like to ask you, Daniel, who are you? Who or what is OG Rose?
Well, thank you, Philippe. I appreciate it. And it's wonderful to be here. I always love speaking with you. I've had such a blast. So thank you for having me today. OG Rose means Opperman Garner Rose. Opperman is Michelle's last name, and our middle name is Garner. And so Rose is her middle name, also named after her grandmother, and Garner is my last name. So it's kind of OG Opperman Garner Rose. That means we work together. And it goes from there. We came up with it in about 2010, sitting in the back of Unoya, which was an art gallery, venue, and performance place that we worked together. I had been writing a bunch of fiction, like a novel called Eusilio, a bunch of short stories, plays. When I was a kid, I worked on a very 7-book science fiction series called The Sword of Tribulation. Michelle, before we were married, was interested. She was reading. She was sharing some of her stuff with me, and we started working together. So we're like, oh, well, we'll write together under OG Rose. Because the thing with it is, like, she would write something like with flashlights, and then I would read, and we have a lot of conversations about it. Then I would give it back, and it got to the point where, say, she would read, say, the ornithologist who studied the stars, or the drunkard, or the reason, or these different stories, and would so much become an integral part of the story and the redoing it that it didn't feel like a, say, writer-editor relationship. It felt deeper
Okay. All
than
right.
that. So then we would think in terms of OG Rose. And so that's what we started writing under. We did a lot of fiction and have done a lot of fiction. It's kind of funny because now a lot of what we do, say, on YouTube is mostly philosophy or different things. And a lot of that, too, has been where if you put up your fiction, you can't submit to magazines, you can't do, say, literary agents or different things. So kind of the putting ourselves out there has been on the philosophy side, which has been really neat. Because then we had no idea there was such a growing community of people online who are interested in that sort of thing. So
No,
that's so
yes.
that's so that's what we've been doing. So OG Rose, funny enough, in 2010 when we did it, we did not know about Original Gangster, so now it seems like Original Gangster, which is a phrase, but it's just Opperman Garner Rose, and sort of rising together in different things. And I do a lot of the
Hmm.
YouTube. Michelle will run the anchor, say I'll do the Twitter, she does the Instagram, we do the OG Rose conversations, we do papers and different things. So it's been really neat. I think it's very nice when the person that you're married with, kind of the creative project you do together is shared like that, but
Yeah,
also to have this.
it's very unique. Go on.
Yeah, and we like it, but there's also distinction. Like, for example, it's like she has complete control over Anchor. She has complete control over Instagram. So there's also this element of you do it together, but there's also individuation, and I think finding that balance is also important to do.
Hmm.
And that's been very neat. So at the same, I worked at a wholesale for a number of years, unloading trucks, selling product. We run a wedding venue and different things. So, you have your work that's paying your bills on the side, the font, all these different things. And then you have this shared creative work that you do together that is really neat.
Hmm.
And I would say also with that, just very naturally, the philosophy you end up doing ends up being tied very much to kind of your daily in and out life, common life, the concrete, because it's really interesting. Like, a lot of times Michelle and I will be discussing topics that are kind of relative, that have come up in the marriage or that have come up in daily life, that then a philosophical lens really helps you think through, because you can
Hmm.
go, oh, you interpreted that way, I interpreted this way, why did we think that way, what do you mean by this would be best? You really do say, in my opinion, I think in a marriage context, you can really see how philosophical skills are really, really helpful, because it gives you that ability to move from the immediate to the big picture, the immediate and the big picture, and then to be using it in OG Rose for a creative way, to also create out of it, so you can get a
Hmm.
better hold on your thoughts. You can recall it better, but then you can share it with other people and think you're creating something. So that's generally the OG Rose schema.
Okay. Wow. Wow, that's wonderful. Interesting. It's like Socrates being married to another Socrates, right? Getting to do philosophy in everything, right?
Mm.
And I can imagine, like, there is never really a normal day for you because the ordinary just becomes extraordinary, right? And if your wife comes and asks you how are you doing, you just get face like smashed by that kind of question. Like, oh my God, how
Oh,
am I doing? What does it mean to be a how in a certain situation? Right? And then off you go. That's the rest of that day sorted, right?
really
um,
funny.
so I want to pose another funny question, and that is like, so it sounds almost like you guys have kind of construed together a fictional alter ego, right? The way writers and authors do sometimes, to create these fictional alter egos. But if it's a collaborative thing, who has the majority rights in case things go difficult, sour, as it were?
Well, the copyright will be what the copyright is. You'll see. So, all the more incentive to make sure they don't go sour, and all the more incentive to get deeper into philosophy to help keep it right, and
You
to keep
heard
it
it from the
alive
man
and new.
itself.
There you go, right?
Don't
Philosophy.
count on trouble. Just dig this
Do
up
the
really deep.
just go deep, man. Get them roots. Get that
Yeah,
roots. That's
get
really
them
funny.
roots.
That's funny. Well, with it, so you'll do things like, for example, if someone came up and said, Flashlight, for example, is by OG Rose, but we say, but Michelle is the prime writer, Daniel is the secondary writer, if somebody asked, right?
Okay.
So, like, also on the Anchor, Michelle is primary on the Anchor,
Right.
where I'm primary on YouTube, but also there's a secondary role as well. So, when it comes, there does have to be some sort of defining of on
Yeah.
what, because you literally, like, what doesn't work if you try to sit beside one another on the laptop and write a paper together, it's too back and forth. You can't ever get into the flow state. So kind of you do your work separate, and then you share, then you talk about it, and you go back, and it's kind of that back and forth sort of thing. So certainly, for example, Michelle did a series on Hans Ruckmacher's on modern art, the modern art, and Hans Ruckmacher is a great thinker. I read him a while ago, and we talked about Hans Rucker a lot, but the series that he did on Anchor is primarily heard. So if somebody asked, you'd say, oh, the series is done by OG Rose, primarily done by Michelle, for example. Or some of the OG Rose conversations, like she did one with Bethany Tabor. There's one on Sam Willem coming up on architecture. Brilliant. That she'll be the host of some, and then other ones I'll be the host. Like I had one with Raymond recently talking about his new book on studying thymos and different things. So we do kind of that, but by having it kind of be a shared thing, there's also a practical element as well, where as opposed to Daniel building a platform, Michelle building a platform, and all of the double marketing and difficulty of that. I don't like Instagram. I don't like social media at all. But then I do also acknowledge the role that it plays in marketing in different things. Well, she can do the Instagram, I can do the Twitter. If she also to that structure, since we have 3 children, is also very useful. Because then, like, for example, she'll like when she was talking with Miss Tabor or Jesse, like I'll take the kids to the dance class or different things, or she'll do it, or different things. So you have a way to always, both parties, be building toward the same platform as you're doing the things that you need to be done, as opposed to do 2 different platforms and 2 different channels and all that, which also is not, then it becomes very stressful. And I think it's really important in the creative work to do it in a manner that you can consistently do it long term. But then the thing about that, though, is I think making it go long term, it also has to feel like it's part of your life. Whereas if you say, oh, I'm going to do philosophy projects that have nothing to do with my everyday, well, they can be very tertiary. But for us, where philosophy and philosophical thinking so vividly helps with family, with deciding, with thinking, with relating and relationships, and it feels like it's all part together. So you could say OG Rose represents that that schema of operation, I suppose.
Well, it's like any well-run functioning organization. Corporations, they figured it out. Different departments, different tasks. People specialize in certain things, and they get to do their thing. They get to be good at something, and then they support each other mutually, right? Reinforce each other. So that sounds like something of an achievement, right? It's very rare, and really, you and Michelle are the first people I've come across who have this kind of deep intellectual creative thing you share at the same time as there is a lot of organization and independent work alongside all of this. So it's well done to you. It's really fascinating. It's like a social experiment unto itself.
Well, you're very kind, Philippe. I will say I was very fortunate to marry an extraordinary woman who is extraordinarily capable in all that she puts herself in. I think also we ran Unoya for a bit, so there's an artistic dimension as well, a creative dimension that's kind of open to making something. And she was a dancer for a long time. I worked as a photographer, a writer, all these different things. And to be involved with someone who has that creative spirit and is as magnificent as she is, I think makes it possible. So it would not be possible without her in any way whatsoever, to also have that kind of openness, that kind of willingness to be creative and to see what happens and to make something occur. The other thing I'll say about that before I forget, and you put it well, it's kind of like a corporation. So like OG Rose LLC, maybe limited liability or something. Haven's like the financial officer, I suppose.
OG Rose, creative capital.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Creative, not destruction. So the other thing that's really neat, I think that's nice about it, is when you have kind of a creative work, and I say this to anyone who might be listening, it's also nice because it is a way to attract friends or community that share in something that you do, which creates a common foundation that you feel like you can also build with other people, like in what they're doing and it's a really neat. I really do think creativity and philosophy, which sometimes, art, philosophy can be, people can talk about it like it's very elitist, it's very abstract, and things like that. I strongly believe, and we see it ourselves, that it is a very powerful force of friendship, of community and relationship. And it really, because the people who do it want to go deep with you and they want to like talk about real things. And that creates a very powerful bond, I think. So it's also been neat to have a way, and having that be central to our marriage, where it can be a way to also encounter friends and community, and it not be kind of isolationist, which I think can happen sometimes because you're so busy with your daily life and your kids and whatever, and then you haven't visited the neighbor in 5 years. So to have a kind of structure that can bring people together in a meaningful way is very nice.
Yeah, I can see that. Looking at my own life, the friends that I have now, that I've had for years, even though we've been continents apart, is people I met during uni, during times of when we were studying philosophy together. And they're not necessarily studying philosophy, the others. They could have studied history or studied another subject, but we met at a place where we were both sort of exploring what was most meaningful to us, where we kind of figured out what is the ultimate concern. How do we go about doing things? And each of us kind of went into this thing from different direction, but we all had the same sort of investment in this. And myself, still digging into it, and the people I keep in touch with are also doing that. And even though we haven't spoken for like maybe some months, it's easy to pick up the thread again because, yes, we know in a deep level we're on this trip together, right? And it's just we know we're on the same mountain. We're just catching up. I didn't see you over the slope over there, around there. So
I think that's a beautiful way to put it. If I tell you, hey, Philippe, I was at the wedding venue yesterday. Well, unless you work a wedding venue, you can say, oh, you may ask questions about it. You may be interested, but one of the reasons I think as people become adults, especially whatever that means, arguably no one's an adult, but whatever, as you get older and go into the work world, and you specialize in whatever it is you specialize, it tends to be only your coworkers really know what you're doing every single day because it's very much tied to the immediate environment. And so gradually your friends and your coworkers get blended together for good and for bad. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. But the thing that's very nice about philosophy is it allows you to have something to speak about that is not so tied to your immediate circumstance that you really can't, like, if I tell you, I worked at the wedding venue, unless you have experiencing do that, it's hard to know what to ask next other than kind of questions, right? Or to like add value, like to say something that kind of progresses the conversation because it's so tied to the immediate facticity of working at a wedding venue or unloading trucks or being on a farm. But philosophy, because of the universal character of it, of which is obviously tied to the concrete, but it's a more universal character to it, it allows the possibility of everyone in their own unique conditions to be working on it in their own way. So then when they come together, they have a way to relate and to progress the conversation because you're dealing something that is not so bound by the particular life path that you took. And I think that is an incredibly powerful asset because it's exactly what you say. You haven't seen Vincent, a good friend of mine, Vincent Samir, you see him and it's like no time passed at all. There's this like, boom, you just pick up, like you say, I love what you said there, on different parts of the mountain. And that is another dimension of philosophy I really don't think can be overstated in its power to make connections and to maintain connections, because it is not so bound up with the immediate facticity. Because again, just in the point, everyone has to make life choices. Some people are going to go unload trucks. Some people will go to a professorship. Some people will go run a florist or something. Well, if those people meet again, it's like they occupy different worlds, and it's hard to know, other than to ask kind of trivia questions. What do you do? What does your workday look like? Like, kind of trivia sound, it's kind of like a trivia question, like answer this question, and you go and there's nothing else to say because you answered the question. That's an inherent dimension of growing up, that's going to occur, that kind of separation into unique particular structures.
Yeah.
Philosophy helps you overcome that problem in very profound ways. And so it's very good for friendship. I think it's very, very good for community.
Yeah, I think, to sort of bracket philosophy out of it, we are a mystery to ourselves.
Yes.
Right? In the deepest sense of who and what we are, we don't have the foggiest idea. Well, right. Maybe we have the foggiest idea. That's about it, right?
We got one, the foggiest possible idea. We have that
one. So, the mystery and the ecstasy and the profoundness of it, that's going to keep on going on and on, right? But performatively, in practical terms, philosophy is also very creative. People have to think about how to ask a question well-formed, and if somebody comes up with, this or that political issue or maybe ethical issue, well, thinking about it, right? Philosophical activity. But you got all these others creative activities that we humans do, art, religion, culture, and so on. And sports, right? Because sports is a game. And games, the fascinating thing about it is you have set rules, but how you play by those rules alters all the time, right? So I think we are really drawn to things that are creative. That is what sustains us, and I think keeps things going for a long while, because it keeps giving itself. It furnishes new things. It's like its own source, right? Its own fountainhead.
Well, I'll add to that. So, for example, I had to go meet the rental company today to pick up the cups and the glasses that they got, because sometimes what people do, they'll rent the dishes from somewhere else and they have to pick it up. So I went and picked it up, and I come back. I'm going through the kitchen, and Michelle started reading the other night Philip Reeve's book Charisma, because I'm talking about the triumph of the therapeutic with Raymond too soon, and we started talking about that book, and I didn't expect that. Totally unexpected conversation, but it's new and it's alive and it's interesting. So one of the things when you have that creative work, whenever you just kind of walk into the kitchen, something new can come. So you started, she's going to be presenting on Zarathustra, the Philosophy Portal presentation on that as well. So we're talking about, Nietzsche and family. What does it mean to like think as a Nietzschean and yet have children, right? That's usually not, that's a really interesting, like, what does that mean? And she's had and it's really been fascinating talking about her. And I don't want to spoil it because he's given the presentation, but her readings of Zarathustra in a feminine lens, just really fascinating. And but it's new, it's creative. You don't expect that. And the other reason why, I'm glad you actually brought this up. One of the things I think about all the time, like especially when I was working at the wholesale, you'd come home from work, for example, and you had a terrible day, because that's what they basically pay you for having terrible days. Where you're doing your manual labor.
It's compensation for misery.
Basically, not always, but it's like, it's not good. And so your wife asks you, how was your day? There's a funny tension I think you can feel, where one, if you tell them how your day was honestly, it's like you're sharing the misery, and you don't really want to do that because it almost feels unloving to do that. But then you also have this tension of not just wanting to say fine. Also, if you tell them how your day was, it's like, from just growing up that it's not good to complain, right? You don't want to complain. And it's very difficult to talk about what happened today if it was not good and wonder if you're complaining. Like, there's a tension there, right? And so I think what can happen a lot of times is people don't know how to talk about their days precisely because there's all these kind of ethical tensions that actually arise. It's like, oh, is it unloving to share that it was tough? Is it unloving? And even too, a lot of times when you're doing work, you're in robot mode. You're not even like, you're just doing what you need to do. So then when someone asks you afterwards, how was your day? You're like, I don't remember. It's almost like I don't remember, right? One of the beauties
That's
of
the point.
philosophy, yeah,
Trying to
that's the
forget
point.
about
That's
it. Yeah.
basically
Yeah.
one of the beauties of creativity and philosophy is you have something to talk about as husband and wife that does not have those ethical dilemmas. So you can have a perpetual conversation and a perpetual creativity that I think is good for intimacy. That if you don't have that, and I think this happens to a lot of couples, generally, I do think this happens a lot, of this kind of tension of how to talk about work and not. Because then the other thing, if you're sitting there at dinner and you're talking about how your day was bad, well, now everyone's feeling bad because your day was bad, and it's like anger and emotion, and it's like really weird to know how to organize that. I don't know if you even can. Well, but then what do? But then the only alternative is to sit there silently and not say anything. And that's not good either. But creativity and philosophy, and actually, I guess you could say classically culture, like being, doing culture and the arts and thinking and different things like they talk about. I think you definitely see, and it's just hard to talk about culture now because people think that's elitist. Culture is good for relationships. If we're talking about this way, it is very good. It provides a way to talk and escape all these weird tensions of the workday, and to actually, and the thing is about it, it also creates deep attention. Because if Michelle's talking about her feminist a kind of more female interpretation of Nietzsche, you have to pay attention. And what is something that people talk about in relationships that's a problem, right? They'll say they don't feel like they're being paid attention to, right? They'll feel like you're not focused on me, you're looking at your phone or whatever. Creativity and philosophy demands that, like, you're not going to do it if you're not paying attention. You have to focus, and you have to be in it.
It also makes it much easier to focus because
Yes.
it's interesting.
Yes, that's exactly right.
It's like you feel like you're not even putting any effort or energy into it. It just happens by itself, right?
That's so important, because if you're in your relationship playing this, well, I paid attention to 30 minutes to you, and now you got to pay, and it's like a tit for tat thing, you're in so much trouble. You're in so much trouble if it's a tit for tat thing, because then there's a list and it's a mess. But you see, when you're focusing and it doesn't even feel like you're focusing, because you're like, wow, Michelle, that's a really brilliant take on the bridge, on what, Nietzsche means by bridge with the Overman. Oh my gosh. You're not even trying. It just happens. And that also is what happens. Like you mentioned friendships or philosophy friendship. You'll spend 5 hours with them and not even realize it. And you've been focused on them and they feel that intimacy. Where if you don't have that, a lot of friendships can be, well, a tit for tat. I came in, I saw you for an hour and did this with you, and what are you going to do for me? And it becomes an effort, it becomes a burden. Basically, when relationships become tit for tats or burdens, they probably have an expiration date. And if they don't have an expiration date, you may want them to have an expiration date.
They're turning into finite relationships instead of infinite.
Oh yeah, the course, infinite game, finite. Yeah. No, there's a lot of truth to that. And the thing with, again, I just am always amazed personally, and I just don't think it's disgusting. I think people know it who do it. Philosophy and creativity are unbelievably good, in my opinion, for relationships. They are unbelievably good for it. But again, it's one of those things we were talking in our last conversation, where you have to do it to get it. And if you don't do it, you don't know what you're missing out. It actually, if you do the philosophy and that creative engagement, you really see how powerful it is for relationships. Because that's been an experience, and you can say OG Rose is pointing to that kind of reality again. The LLC with Haven as the financial minister, or different. He's turned into a minister now, so he's upgraded. He got promoted.
So, I want to then ask, as a very quick follow-up: are there any downsides whatsoever
to doing that? The downside is that other people, like, who are not philosophical, think that there's a problem because you're philosophical, because you don't meet the social boxes of what they think a relationship should be, doing these different things. So they think there are problems. And you have outside parties that can cause stress or problems or drama, which then you just have to learn to not worry about that. And I think with time that becomes, easier. I think it becomes a lot easier with time, because it bears fruit. You see the fruit that comes of one way of life versus another way of life. And you're not being judged. It's not a judgment. People would say that sounds judgmental. No. I mean, a tree bears fruit or not. It's an assessment. A judgment is when I say you are a liar. An assessment is when I say you lied. Like judgment is when I define your very essence as I'm using it. I know philosophically these terms mean different things, but no one is judging like someone's essence as being inferior or something like that. But what you see is with time, the fruit that you can assess that comes from a way of life that is able to be creatively engaged with the people you care about, as opposed to someone that doesn't feel engaged unless, say, you go to the mall together or go to the baseball together or watch Netflix together. Nothing wrong with any of that. But if that becomes your kind of metric for a healthy relationship or a fun day, that can be a problem. Because you can never go to the mall enough times. Like let's say you go for 2 hours. Well, the other 22 hours of the day, you're not going, right? Or when you're awake, I guess 14 hours of the day. So that I would say that is the biggest challenge, is outside people. Now, you may be blessed and surrounded by people who are more able to not worry about other people. But I will say, if you do creativity and philosophy, you tend to be a target of worry. You tend to be targeted by people who worry, and people think there's something wrong, and so on and so forth. And you've got to resist that. And you've got to stand, you got to stand in what you believe in and what you do, and stand for that, and not get kind of thrown off by outside worry or things like that.
Okay. Yeah. So in what you're saying, seems to me that in doing philosophy, we are natively interested in the truth. And it turns out some activities are better than others, more rewarding than others, more rational than others.
Yes.
And that might make it seem that the less rational, the less rewarding, come up in a kind of contest or competition with the other one, right? And that this might be a source of animosity. The second thing you talked about that I wanted to comment on. Nope, the focus back.
I was talking about outside people looking in who are worried, target of worry, where you've got to stand for what you believe. Look, I love a good visit to the mall to play the arcade. Okay. I was really good at Street Fighter. Okay, really good in the arcade.
It's come back to me now. In sort of standing your ground and doing what you believe is better and right and so on, that can also be taxing if you're in an environment where that is not supported, right? If you meet too much annoyance, antagonism, and so on, it can wear you down, right? Habits are the bread and butter of our everyday, and if your habit, a big chunk of your habit is having to fend off animosity, it becomes a real issue. Yes. I would think. But it sounds to me like you're not in that environment.
No, not at all. And I think with time, if you stand and then other people also see the fruit and they don't see problems or different things, then they can get calmer. Also, when you have the ability, like we were talking about friends and community and different people you can meet, the more you find that, the more you have those different people, you then have a supportive network of people that do believe in what you're doing. And so you get that balance. But I do think when you start out, especially before there was the ability to have Zoom calls like this, where I can speak to you all the way on the other side of the world, right? Yeah. I think it was much harder not to be isolated if you did, say, creative or philosophical work, and then you would have you'd be the same target of worry and not have any counterbalance. So I think now there are ways to get the counterbalance that were not available in the past, but you still have to do them. Like you still have to go and look. It's not going to necessarily come to you, right? You got to take initiative to make it happen. But I would encourage everyone to make it happen and to do it and to see, because there are so many people. Like, I'm just amazed. I'm sure on planet Earth, I would be amazed if 10% care about philosophy. Maybe it's more. I'm just throwing out a number. That's still millions of people. That's still millions of people, right? So they're out there. It might not be, it's a minority, but it's still millions. And I'm always amazed by how many of those people, when you find them, are in fact open to your ideas, your work, and to meeting you. So if you're in that place of not feeling supported, there are people that will support you if you've done the work. And you probably have, because the whole reason you're rejected is because you did the work. And so that you just go and find them. And people who care about the truth, they don't care. Like they don't have like a list of qualifications you have to meet. You just have to be pursuing the truth and doing your best to articulate it. So if you're doing that, well, then put yourself in the place where you can meet people who are also doing that, and you can get that counterbalance support.
Oh, you're pursuing the truth too? Well, we got something in common.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What you something in what you said reminds me of like the nature of a rational society, and that is where, yeah, the more people who do it, this certain activity that is rational, the more everybody wins.
Yes.
Right. So it's not like we win because some other people lose. No, the more people are in it, this in the system or in the activity or in the organization or whatever, right? The more everybody benefits, right? So it's a wonderful universal element to it, or like it kind of expresses the universality that philosophy often thinks about.
Right. And I think that that's very well put, because that's one of the reasons I think the relationships that are formed in that context of seeking truth can in fact be so good and beautiful and deep, is because it's a non-zero sum game as opposed to a zero sum game, where very often, not always, it depends, but very often in, say, marketplace interactions, there can be a more competitive edge, which I'm not saying competition is not bad. We have to be careful before we make it sound like competition is always bad. But you see, if I'm competing with you, but we're both, say, looking for truth, then it's more like I'm pushing you and you're pushing me, as opposed trying to beat one another. Like you're trying to say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? A relationship of philosophy or that sort of community, everyone will push one another and try to take it to the next level or figure out what they mean. But that's very different from trying to, say, defeat one another. Now, of course, it depends, because there are some situations, like we said last time, there are some situations where straight up kind of more vicious insult can be called for. And there are situations where defeat is necessary. But generally speaking, when you have that non-zero sumness, there's a push. So there's a growth. It's not just everyone sitting around in a happy community where we don't do anything. No, there's a push. There's a calling one another to be them better selves. But it's in a manner of also in that push being there to help. And that creates this really beautiful dynamic where there's pushing, but there's help. There's support, but there's also support pushing you up the mountain. And that's such a unique, I think, relational dynamic that is part of the power of it that you find in, like you say, in the rational community that feels deep. And it feels like you're doing, you're moving in that movement to know truth better.
Yeah. And we might add to that something you mentioned earlier, which is the work itself, right? You put in the work. This stuff is not easy. Philosophy is really, really not easy. And it's hard to do well. It's really hard to make exceptional, work or even articulate yourself properly and so on and so forth. So there is a respect that sort of emanates from one or from others towards you when you do good work, when you do put in a good piece of writing or a good argument or a good presentation, what have you, right? So this, like many other kind of skills disciplines that we do as human beings, something we enjoy seeing, right?
Yes.
We enjoy having a world where our skilled people, because they can teach us, and we again grow more from it. So yeah, go on.
No, I think that's very well put. Something I was talking with Raymond about, who's been talking about thymos and your eros, your rationale, but you also have thymos in classical thought, which is kind of a lot of its spiritedness, but it also has a lot to do with the feeling that you rose to the occasion, that you overcame, that you did something hard. And basically, and Raymond will talk about Fukuyama, there's this notion that the Nietzschean last man doesn't have any thymos. He might be very rational. He might be very, might have great eros, and that's not just sexual. It can just be consumer. It can have a lot of things to it. But he lacks thymos, right? He lacks this kind of spiritedness or this feeling of challenge. And human beings tend to be quite unhappy if they don't have any challenge in their life, or they don't have any feeling of doing something that was difficult that they overcame. One of the beautiful things of philosophy and creativity is, because of that challenge, is that it can scratch that thymotic itch, if you will. It creates a way to get some of that thymos, that way of challenging, because it is difficult. And I think it is very important for human beings to feel like that they are doing something that's hard. Now, the problem is there's a difference between hard and toil. A lot of times people say we'll go to work and they'll have a hard day at work, but it's more like a toil. It's more like there was a lot of toil and there was a lot of difficulty, but hard is more like climbing a mountain. There's like a going to somewhere. It's hard to say run in place in a hamster wheel. That's not easy, but that's not necessarily going to address thymos. To have thymos, it's more like going on a wrestling mat. It's more like climbing a mountain where there is somewhere that one is going that they don't even know if they're going to make it, but we're going to put forth the courage and put forth the strength and difficulty to try to get there to the best of our abilities. And philosophy and friendships too, like you said, you put it very well. Relationships that feel like there's a thymotic element where you respect one another because we're doing this work together. That's another reason why they're so strong. Like Michelle's reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra. You're like, obviously, you're like, okay, there's respect there. Because and that actually reminds you, and then I'll give it back to you. There's all this talk about like men like to be respected and women like to be loved, and there's all these kind of breaks down as different things. There's all truth to it. Of course there is. But then all of those books will say, but everyone wants both. Okay, all right, that's true. Everyone wants both. But how do you figure out the correct ratio of the bothness? Is it 60% respect for men, 40% love? Is it 60%, whatever? And it becomes very difficult. The beautiful thing about the creative philosophical life is you have in that a bothness. There is love and respect in the relationship that is at play, where when both partners are part of it, you feel that there's respect going on and you feel that there's love going on. You feel like there's truth, there's beauty and goodness, as opposed to thinking it helps you not get stuck in a lot of the kind of the simple dichotomies. If I'm thinking in my marriage, particularly of where it's like, oh, well, as a woman, they want more love. As a man, you want more respect. But then how do you break that down if at the end of the day it's both? Well, it's live and particularized and emerges out of the shared creative work. So that's another reason. And it also happens with your friends. That's another reason why I think philosophy can be so useful for relationships, is because it provides that bothness, it provides the thematic, it provides the deep, it provides a shared context, and it just does so much.
Yeah, that's well put. So a question that sort of came to me when you were speaking, because I agree with you that there is this difference between hard work and needless toil, right? But then there is also maybe a difference between the various ways in which we can think about ourselves doing certain things in certain analogies or certain pictures, and then actually doing the thing. Because we can speak about doing philosophy as if it's climbing a mountain or, crossing I don't know, some sort of imagery, some sort of motivational kind of uplift, right? But you sit down with the science of logic, there's no mountain there. Being pure being without further determination. Right. So the motivational kind of examples, images, they get you in a certain way, but by themselves, I fear that this is a worry I have, they might themselves turn structurally into a kind of toil, right? So you kind of need to, and this is where I think intelligence needs to come into the play to figure out, okay, what is following this kind of toil road principle, and what is the actual work where what I'm supposed to be doing is, pertinent to that, just to that thing, and not something that is just collapsible into certain analogies. Do you see what I mean?
That's one of the most important points that you're just bringing up, that I am particularly in a lot of the O.G. Rose work. Michelle and I will talk about all this all the time about the problem of metaphor, and how, for example, metaphor, and you got Hofstadter, he wrote a book, Surface and Essence, you got The Metaphors We Think, you got the Neil Postman, you got a number of books, I.A. Richards, who will talk about, like I.A. Richards' famous experiment is if you you take a class and you divide it up into 3 groups. And one class, you tell them education is a river. The next one, you tell them education is a mountain. And the third one, you say education is a garden. And then you say, write whatever you want. And what you see is that the very philosophy of education that emerges is profoundly tied to the metaphor. Like you literally get entirely different philosophies. He didn't force them to write different philosophies. All he said is that at some point, make sure you use this metaphor. And what he was showing is that metaphor structure thought more than thought structures metaphor. And then you get like a Hofstadter or different things, and he's basically saying the brain is primarily an analogy. It operates by making analogous connections and different things. Well, this is a problem because if we so naturally think in terms of metaphors that then structure our thinking more than the other way around, then you can almost have a Deleuzian capture occur and not even realize it's happening. But then we've all learned in English classrooms that a mixed metaphor is bad. That means you did a bad job at a mixed metaphor. But there's a funny way in which a mixed metaphor might be good to destabilize the structure so that you don't so easily fall into thinking a certain way and not realizing it. Now, I'm not defending mixed metaphors, but one of the pieces and thoughts is called transitional metaphors, which is saying the incredible need to think a metaphor. And you said this last time that was so good. Like, we have to have categories, but you need to think them to the point of failure, right? You need them, but you have to think them to the point where you start seeing that, wait a minute, this is a category, and then kind of transition. I think we have to do something very, very similar with metaphors. By all means, think about all the ways that education is like a garden, but then realize that after you're done with that, there are also ways where it's like a mountain. Oh, and then realize at the end of the day that it actually might be like an ocean, or maybe it's just like a family, and keep thinking through each one of those and transition from one to the next, or your thinking is going to get stuck. Like you say, when one reads The Science of Logic, if one ever reads it, as opposed to open and just kind of cry a little bit, it's not a mountain, and yet it feels like a mountain, right? So what exactly is going on? Why does it feel? It's such a fascinating question. Why does it feel so right to say that philosophy is a mountain when there literally is no physical mountain? And yet one is groping around, trying to find a way to get at what is going on, right? But then in our previous conversations, we've talked about so much of the garden metaphor being incredibly useful, where you create the conditions and something emerges that you do not know or predict is going to occur. So for me, there's a few things that come with this. One, it's incredibly important. I find it very, very important to do literary, artistic endeavors, to understand metaphors, to think of good metaphors, and to be able to transition metaphors, because there's a skill going on there that's going to help your thinking from being captured. The next thing that I think is important is to make sure that you do not say write or think around a metaphor, that you employ metaphors, but then you're able to step back from them and move on to the next thing. Because if not, like you say, you can get trapped. So one of the things for me is like, philosophy is a mountain, but I guess a metaphor that I always come back to that I like because I'm obsessed with artistic metaphors is it's like a dance. Ballroom dancing is insanely difficult. Like, if you do professional dancing, it will exhaust you to death. Like ballet or different things, it is so incredibly hard and muscular.
I've had the pleasure.
Oh my gosh, I salute you, sir. It blows my mind, the physical exertion that comes out in like a ballroom.
It was very brief.
And it was for me as well. And then I was like, let me go back to wrestling because this is no. So anyway, but in dance, I like thinking about a lot of artistic metaphors because there's a difficulty that's there, but also a art form or a kind of elegance that has to be employed, a kind of finesse that has to be there, but the finesse is not, it's very difficult to get to the place where you can have that finesse. Yeah. And also there's an emergence, there's an improvisation, there's a space for something happening that you don't know is going to happen. So to answer your question, what I would say is, I think the danger that you're pointing at is so important. That's why knowing that happens is important. So you engage in transitional metaphors. And then I personally tend to gravitate especially to metaphors based on the creative practice itself, because I find in that a very interesting blend between intention, hard work, emergence for something unexpected, and then also there's a communal element as well, because as a writer doing poetry, you interact with people, you have people read your work, who get back to you, that you need other people because you think it's really good, and then you give it and you find out. So for me, in the same way that you ultimately cannot escape categories, you need them, but there's also a risk and danger there. So it goes with metaphors, and that's where I kind of link in a artistic metaphoric direction.
Okay, so you Thanks a lot, Daniel. There's a lot useful things you said there. So I wanted to ask you to unpack a little thing you said, and that is, you said at some point one needs to take a distance from metaphors to step back. Okay, well, how does one do that without evoking yet another metaphor to do just that? All right. What would be your approach?
That's an extremely Incredible question. And actually, it's an obsession of mine, because it's similar to how does one step back from like A is A, right? Like, or categories, or thinking that this is a laptop and you say it is, but then you step back and go, well, wait, the map isn't the territory. Well, the moment you say
That's
that,
another metaphor again, I
yeah,
think.
exactly. You're like always falling into it, right? And yet there's a kind of pullback that is necessary just to fall again. To me, that gets into a kind of structure that thinking operates that then becomes a major obsession to me in a lot of philosophical reason. I call this irony. The
Uh-huh.
thing that I'm really interested, or if you were to go back and say, young Daniel, what was one of the things that got you really interested in philosophy? It would be the topics of self-deception and irony. And we've talked about that, and then not being able to see my face and why are there words, pictures in my head. But irony has always fascinated me, because
Uh-huh.
irony is where you do Y planning to get X, and Y is precisely why you don't get X. Like, it's always like the very mechanism of avoiding the thing is why one falls into the thing. And so likewise, there's an irony where we say one tries to avoid metaphor by creating a new metaphor. They're escaping a metaphor by making another. So you participate in the very thing. To me, that got into the tragic, ironic nature of thought itself. And then that gets for me into questions of what kind of beings are human beings to think this way. What is the human being to think that way? And this was years ago, and then I got obsessed with the A is A and how does that work and different things like that. For me, one of the ways I deal with that problem is if I know thought itself is so tied to metaphor, then the way I step out of metaphor has to be almost kind of stepping out of thought in lived experience, getting your hands dirty in the garden, action, experience, encountering other people in different things. Because just as soon as I go back into thinking, it's only a matter of time before I fall into another metaphor or another analogy. So this is where I got, it again kind of got tied, we talked about it last time, a lot into like David Hume, the common life, the emotions of the sentiment. I don't experience my emotions as metaphor. I don't experience actually the neighbor when I'm asking them, do they need help in the garden or different things. I don't experience that as a metaphor. But then when I'm in the garden, I'm suddenly going, oh, wait, this is kind of like philosophy. And now it's a metaphor. So now I've gone back into that. So I find this gets into why there's such a necessity of living, if you will, going into the world to help balance that. Because I don't think you can ever totally escape the problem of metaphor. But if you're aware of it, I think you can engage in more transitional practices.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. Well, that's certainly, I agree. That is it's really challenging to think about. The thing that sort of sticks out to me in what you're saying is that thinking of metaphor in terms of as a category, if I understood it correctly.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you mean category in the sense of like Kant and Hegel talked about categories, or do you mean category in a more loose sense?
I'm more loose sense,
Okay.
sense. For me,
More in a
like
metaphorical sense.
Yes. That's exactly right. That's really funny. Because once I say like education is a tree, well, then I've created a category, and then all the evidence will fall under that of which makes it the case. Like I've
Yeah, but
created
why a tree?
framing.
Why not a big sort of
Well, that's
network of
exactly
mushrooms?
right. Why a tree? Another like just kind of rule of thumb: be careful to create any metaphors regarding a thing you haven't touched with your own hands or that you've experienced, that you've gone out and got dirty, for example. Because, for example, there's a difference between using a garden as a metaphor when you yourself have never gone in a garden and sort of used it, right? And seen what it's like. So as a kind
an
of
actual garden, not a
an
metaphorical
actual
garden.
garden, right?
Just to make sure.
Absolutely. There's so for me, like if indeed I can't escape metaphor, then one of the things I want to do is be aware of metaphors. When I call something a mountain, I want to make sure I myself have climbed a mountain. Mm-hmm. When I call something an ocean, I myself want to have been in an ocean in many different settings. And here's where I think the artistic sentiment is a big deal, especially as like a writer, and really pay attention. Like Flannery O'Connor said, the writer is not afraid to stare. It's one of my favorite phrases. Like to really look at something. And one of the things you see in a garden is there are a lot of bugs eating other bugs. There's a lot of death. There's a lot of decomposition, right? That's what happens in a garden. The other thing you see in a garden is that you put a lot of work into something that then doesn't manifest because you didn't put the soil right. Like a lot of people think of a garden, they think of Eden, and they think it's very cute and it's very nice and it's very peaceful. Well, when you actually have a garden, you see how much death is involved in a garden. You see how much failure is involved in a garden. So like if you say, oh, education is a garden, and you have the image of kind of a perfect Eden, and you're describing that, your metaphor is probably going to be pretty bad. But if you say, well, I've been in a garden, I've managed a garden, I see how it's not a paradise at all, that there's some beauty to it, but it has to be conditioned and worked, and your hands got to get dirty. And like the freaking sunflower leaf, the leaves on the corn will straight up cut your face. Like Michelle one time was walking through the corn and like cut her out. Oh my gosh, it was the worst. They are so sharp. You touch the leaves, they'll sharp you. So when you say education is a metaphor, the educational philosophy that you are going to arise from an experience of a garden as something deadly, frankly, and full of death is going to be very different from someone who says education is a garden and they've only experienced a garden as something that they went and saw for 5 minutes in a park somewhere that was
nice and fluffy.
That's correct. And so for me, that's an example of if you're aware that you're stuck in metaphor, or it's going to be very difficult to get out of it, well then really whatever metaphors you want to use, go and experience, because that will transform the nature of the metaphor. So that's the thing, like you're trapped in metaphor, but by having the experience, you kind of expand the metaphor. You nuance the metaphor. You make it far more interesting. And that can go a long way to helping thought.
Yeah. So when you do write about the garden, you can write about it in a much deeper and more comprehensive and truthful way than if you just look at it from the outside for 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now that's a really good rule of thumb. You hear that, kids? Experience your metaphors.
That's exactly right. Well, it's funny, and actually, just as a little tag on, this is a live thought. You did that wonderful video on Dr. Nieberhauser's channel on philosophy doesn't think the object-subject divide, right? It doesn't think in those terms. It's almost like one is saying that one wants to make sure that their metaphor doesn't have a divide between their metaphor and their experience, right? You don't want to think that divide. You want to make sure that those are very intimately linked together. So I like experience your metaphor, kids. Experience your metaphors.
Yeah. It reminds me of I think it was Blue Velvet by David Lynch.
Nice.
I think that movie begins with, if I remember correctly, it begins with a scene of American suburbia, a guy going across, mowing his lawn, and everything's like picture perfect. People, there's water and there's grass cut and people in the garden sunbathing and everything. And then he gets a heart attack or something, and then he falls over, and then the camera just goes down beneath the blades of grass, and the music changes and it grows dark, right? And you see insects crawling and things and decomposition and basically death. So that's I think he did exactly kind of what you're recommending there, to experience the garden himself and showed it to us in that visual manner.
Oh yeah, and he finds like the thumb in the field, and the villain, the guy with the freaking breathing mask, is one of the most terrifying people. No, David Lynch is so good at that. I went back and watched the classic Twin Peaks, like the one from the early '90s. I was like, wow, because I know the new series came out, and I didn't want to watch that till I'd watched the classic. I always impressed.
No, you do need to watch the older one to watch the new stuff.
Yeah, that's what I understand.
Because like, the thing about Twin Peaks, it starts very sort of kind of normalish, cozy. It has this serial killer element to it, but it's done in a sort of popular way. But slowly but surely, Lynch turns up the temperature. And right. And before you know it, you're being boiled to death by the end of this series, because the weirdness, he just throws us all at you. And the thing about the new season, the reboot thing, or like I don't know what you would call it, but the continuation, the third one, he just continues where he left off on the level of craziness, and he just goes exponentially. So you do need to watch the earlier stuff, otherwise this will just be far too bizarre.
Well, I'm glad you told me that. And that model, one of the reasons I like Lynch is like in what you're describing, like we're saying, you start off with a garden as this quaint paradise, but then you get closer to it and you say, well, yes, it's beautiful, but there's also death here. There's also insects eating other insects. And the truth of the matter is, I don't know if there's anything in the world that is not like that, that there's actually a mixture of it. And that's, to me, the real tyranny of metaphors is the ease by which it allows you to think the thing in the non-mixed manner or the non-tragic manner. That it's both, because you say, oh, it's a
yeah, that's a good point. But I think you can say that about pretty much any concept we have.
yes, but that's
because
why
we like to hold on to simplicity, immediacy, and one-sidedness, which is what Hegel complains about all the time.
Well, that's exactly right, because for me, the nature of metaphor is a kind of insight into thought in general, especially when you follow, like what with Hofstadter, Douglas Hofstadter, he did the Gödelbach and Esker book and blah, 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 but he also did I thought, a better book, in my opinion, on essence and surface. And he's basically, when he's going through that, he's just saying that thought has that sort of metaphoric structure, that analogical structure. It's not by chance that when you hear a 2-hour lecture and somewhere around the hour 35 mark, there was a image that was used, that's what you remember. You remember that. Everything else you don't remember, which is good and bad. If you have a professor who knows the power of metaphor and uses it in a manner that forces you to think, but also to remember what's most important, that's good. But most of the time, what ends up happening is people use metaphors randomly. They use it at different spots here and not there. They're not, say, artistically trained to think about metaphors. So you get a scattered cognition that is latching on to things here and there and then idealizing them and not getting the depths of what is being proposed. And so that's why I think being intentional about metaphor, but that would require, basically, for me, the moment you say you have to be intentional about metaphor, that means you have to engage in artistic practice, like some level of artistic skill. I'm not saying that every philosopher has to go out and be the next, Hart Crane or Wallace Stevens or like that. But I think it is important for a certain awareness of the power of imagery and metaphors and how they capture thinking and how to do them well, so that when you use them, you don't use them in a manner that is sending cognition in a bad direction. Now, what exactly that looks like is probably relative to the person and the different individual. But for me, just even being aware of this problem goes a long way to at least, if you know that fire is dangerous, then the likelihood you keep it in the fireplace and only use it for s'mores is much higher. If you don't know that fire is dangerous, then you'll probably get burned by it a lot more. So I think about metaphor that way, which is a metaphor.
We should have like a metaphor bell. We just keep ding, ding.
That's really funny.
Another thing, you bring up so many wonderful points. My mind is just going, this, like, that's fascinating. So another thing that stuck to me was you mentioned irony, and I've recently been working on the spirit chapter in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit because preparations, and he does in the culture section, he talks about vanity, and this is kind of like the apex of cultural consciousness is this development of vanity or irony. And I would just like to read you a quote, and then I would like to hear your kind of comment on that, if I may.
Please.
So when Hegel speaks about the vain consciousness, he writes, "It is the self existing for itself, which does not only know how to evaluate and how to chatter about everything, but which also knows how to convey wittily the fixed essence of actuality as well as the fixed determinations posited by judgment. And it knows how to speak of them in their contradictions." So Hegel celebrates this. He thinks that we shouldn't remain immediately honest because he thinks that that's dull. The culture doesn't emerge from this. It emerges from this roller coaster of these weird ideas that we have that can seemingly go both ways, like the garden is death and life, right? Beauty and ugliness, sharing the same space. But then a short while after this point, Hegel talks about how, well, once this consciousness becomes aware of itself doing this, it's already transcended this ironic state. It's already transcended into something else, something more. What is the next step? I think it's faith and insight. Moves on to the next thing, but it's basically like it has figured out the truth about itself. Once it knows it is doing this thing, it's not just you know, doing it, not knowing what it is doing. So I wondered, do you see this the same way? Do you think that there is this sense of somebody who knows they're ironic isn't really essentially ironic?
One of the things that I think is really, really unfortunate is that Kierkegaard, when he read Hegel, did not appreciate the notion that there seems to be a bad irony and a good irony. You know, one of the things that Kierkegaard will talk about, and because Kierkegaard hated Hegel, which is really sad, because actually Kierkegaard and Hegel, I think, have a lot of similarities, but Kierkegaard was so convinced, as was the early me, I must admit.
Yeah, here I like the Churchill quotes that you got enemies, good, it means you stood for something.
It's true. Oh, I love Kierkegaard. It's just he saw Hegel as this giant totalizing system, and you know all of those different things. In a manner...
yeah, but Hegel has many people, great philosophers, great thinkers, who despise him
for whatever reason. Absolutely, right? That's part of the game.
Deleuze as well, right?
Absolutely, it's all part of the game. But to me, you know, Kierkegaard's thesis was on irony. And he was extremely interested in the role of irony and different things like that. And what he saw irony could do is that irony could lead into the absolute negate, like this continual ironizing forever and ever in a kind of eternal regression sort of thing. And he was aware that that was a big problem. And so absolute negation, I forget the term. But what Kierkegaard also seems to have not fully appreciated is that Kierkegaard himself, one of the reasons he's so brilliant is the perpetual irony that you'll see going on in his thinking. But it's the difference between an irony that, say, is not aware that it is irony, and an irony that's kind of more postmodern, that it's going to be engaging in irony of irony and just kind of end up devouring itself and kind of eat itself.
Yeah.
In some respects, this reminds me of the distinction between, I hesitate to bring up these terms because they mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. You know, a lot of people say there's modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism. Where metamodernism, I know, right? It just gets better every second. Where the problem with postmodernism is that it attempted to have an autonomous irony that became its own foundation. We can just ironize irony and whatever. But then you see that seems to eventually eat itself. Like if you just have irony that does, but you don't necessarily stand for anything, then you can just have this eternal regression. And then metamodernity posits itself where it doesn't ignore postmodernism. It doesn't throw irony away. It uses irony, say, to stop power or to be aware of the pitfalls that humans can come into and that they are conscious of it. So for me, there is a significant difference between good irony and bad irony. And for me, it actually does, like, there's something that when you realize that human beings have an ironic tendency to them, which actually has a positive thing, because actually if you don't use irony, there's a way in which there's a deficit there. Like if you're not able to use irony or think irony, there's a deficit. But then if you get stuck in irony, then you can become almost a nihilistic deconstructionist, right? But then how do you escape irony? Well, then stuff like faith or reason, or a certain reason that is able to see irony and not be stuck in irony, does in fact seem to be an important step. And I think a lot of the people who are talking about the movement from postmodernity to metamodernity are talking about a movement from a kind of self-enclosed bad irony to a certain good irony that's not a slave to irony, you know, it's not captured by irony, but it also sees a potential benefit to irony. In that, when you can see it, you can use it for your own ends or to use it on a concept to see how it actually cannot be autonomous in of itself. And then also it will help you realize, well, all thinking can have a tendency to fall into this consuming itself principle. So how do I escape that? Well, then you start thinking about faith. You start thinking about other ways of knowing that isn't so prone. So I do think there's a difference between bad irony and good irony. You know, it is not the case that one wants to say irony is always bad. Irony can have a very important role. I mean, look, you know, postmodernity, people forget, you know, postmodernity is a reaction, generally speaking, culturally, is a reaction against the totalizing visions of modernity that is going to create this sort of structure and it will bring us to utopia, both on conservative liberalism, blah, blah, blah. Well, irony is a really powerful tool to stopping that from occurring, or to yourself trying to totalize the world in terms of your own ideas and visions. Irony can be a checks and balances on that, but man cannot live on irony alone. You know, man cannot live on bread alone. And I think Hegel understood that. And I think Kierkegaard understood that too. And unfortunately, he didn't see it in Hegel, when I do think it is in Hegel, just like you read. But that's my opinion.
Yeah. Well, in addition to good and bad irony, we can add ugly irony,
Sure, sure.
which because I agree with you. We can have an irony that's just endlessly kind of satirizing or kind of being flippant or witty about everything and all the time goes on, right? And never making any serious remark up to the point of nihilism, as you said. Or it can be this irony that develops, right? But if we think of that as in use for something else, then I think it turns into an ugly irony
Mm,
because it basically then I start to think that, well, we have something like didactic morality at work here because it's then the irony becomes like the front sort of facade of what's really going on is an underlying morality. And I think people who are um, smart, who know irony, they will smell this and pick up on it, right?
mm.
So it's a fine balance to walk between these two. And but I think that the good irony is the one that develops from it through its own resources into something better. Um, Somebody who I think about, who I think does this pretty well, is Oscar Wilde.
Yes. Oh, yes, 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 yes.
Yeah, he's witty infinitely, but in a way that is uplifting, right? It's not just going on and on and on like in a pessimistic or in a kind of look how smart I am kind of way. Even though he is pretty smart and he is all about that. Look at me how smart I am, but look at me a little bit closer and you'll see something else. He's also got that aspect to it to him, which I think makes him, one of those great authors we all cherish.
Yeah,
So
the short stories that I love to read to the children, which I just adore from him. You know, the bird in the rose with the thorn, and the one of the giant in the garden with the children. Those two short stories. He wrote so many short stories, so many others, so many poems. But that is a great example. It seems to me there is a difference between a sort of bitter irony, kind of a vicious irony, a kind of acid irony,
that might
and
be a
this
better way of putting it. Yeah,
this kind of jovial irony
yeah,
where Michelle and I will talk about ironies all the time that we find. It's like you laugh about it and you're like, oh, isn't that funny? And it's like a joyful, like, look how we as human beings do this. And the thing we always like, if humans never erred, if there was no error or mistake, what would life would be pretty boring, right? And you couldn't be creative either. You couldn't have new things emerge because there has to be that possibility of a break that makes something new emerge. So when one sees the possibility of irony and basically the practical inevitability of irony as the necessary precondition for creation and newness, then it becomes something to see joy in. As long as one then moves from it or uses it in those different services, as opposed
except
to
not using it as for something
sure,
else.
yes, yes,
Yes.
yes, 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 as opposed to this irony in a kind of like dismissive, attacking sort of way. So
Right.
there does seem to be a difference between those very much. I mean, some of the funniest jokes on planet Earth require irony. If there's no irony, there wouldn't be, a lot of the great literature, a lot of the great stories, a lot of the great poems require that irony. But there is a big difference, it seems, between that literary, sublet, powerful, good irony or way that can point to the good or lead to something good, as opposed to this vicious, acid, dismissive sort of irony. So I think that distinction is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Daniel. I wanted to ask you about philosophy, but I find that we've already been discussing philosophy all this time. It's just like it's a seamless transition from
It's beautiful.
OG Rose project, the thing you're doing with your wife, wonderful activities you got going, and then I feel like I taken part in your duo already.
Beautiful, beautiful friend.
Um, so I would like to then close with asking you about what you're teaching, because you're teaching
Mm,
now and again online, right?
mm,
So you have something coming up, I believe, called transformative philosophy.
mm.
What is that about? Is philosophy transformative? And what is going to be your yeah, what are you going to be presenting there?
Well, that's very kind. I appreciate you asking that, Philippe. And yeah, I've wanted. It's a beautiful thing to transition so easily and well into philosophy, and I appreciate you being someone with whom that could occur. So thank you. I do
Well,
have the
thank you,
great.
sir.
Well, thank you. So I adore and love Tim Adlin, who runs VoiceCraft. We were in a Philosophy of Lack series together, and I participate in VoiceCraft as much as I can. Really wonderful people over there. And a class that he's doing that will be in April coming up and is on transformative philosophy and the idea of philosophy as being a force that can change your life. And I would say by transformative, it is important to realize that this is not, we're not talking the kind of self-help transformative where if you take these 3 steps, you know, you'll have $1 million or anything, but transformative kind of in the sense of, as we've been talking about earlier on what philosophy can do, say, in a relationship with people, not because you're using philosophy for that end. It's not like you got into philosophy saying, oh, this will be good for marriage. But if you genuinely and honestly pursue the truth, the good, and the beautiful, there's these secondary effects that it can occur. Only though, if one has that genuine pursuit of not doing it as a use. And that's that funny balance, right? That's kind of always interesting because the moment I talk about
it's a little bit of irony there.
Yeah, no, exactly. But that's another reason why irony has this kind of inescapable dimension. So then how are we going to approach it? Because the moment I start talking about, say, philosophy as being good for a relationship, well, then people are like, oh, well, I should do philosophy because it's good for my relationship. And what's so funny,
I should do philosophy because it's good for my health.
Yeah, it's good for my health. And it's so funny because it doesn't work that way. It has to capture you. It has these second order effects. And yet you can know about the second order effects and not do it for the second order effects. And you see, that is one of the reasons why the topic of how philosophy transforms you is so fascinating to me, is because it doesn't work in a linear manner at all. And how one engages with it so that it does these things is, to me, really fascinating. And it actually comes a little bit back to the ability to step into common life or ready life or getting your hands dirty into the garden, because you actually have to do the things. Like I can tell you, for example, how to do a Peterson roll in wrestling, but you knowing that is not the same as you then doing it. So there seems to be a dialectic between those two things. So the topic, the module that I was going to be doing, so we also have an OG, Michelle and I have a conversation, OG Rose episode on transformative philosophy and what it means and kind of the things that we talk about, and is it transformative? Is it even possible? How is it different from self-help and blah, 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 blah. Because it is a fascinating question, because you're talking about something that only transforms if you're not doing it to be transformed, which is very strange. But again, if there's something about human beings that is fundamentally ironic, it would seem that we have to do something ironic to get it right. So there's some sort of matching the ironic with the ironic that has this
the irony of the good.
Yeah, the irony of the good. I like that. So the module that I would be teaching with Tim, Mr. Adlin, is on the phenomenology of voice, which we also had an OG Rose conversation on that, which is really paying attention phenomenologically to the experience of, say, speaking to someone. What's it like to be into conversation? What are the dynamics that emerge in that? How being aware of that can help facilitate, say, dialogos that you'll see Dr. Vervaeke or different people will be speaking about, like what exactly occurs in a dialogos experience and why, and what is the nature of that interaction, and can it be phenomenologically examined to see what is at play. I actually had actually this is good because Friday, the wonderful Guy Senstock, who I adore, we had a conversation that was on circling in the net and got into a lot of these different topics. So I'm really fascinated in that. And since voice craft is a lot about, in my opinion, the phenomenology of voice, it is discussing that topic and how one can use that in their own life, what that means for their life, and what exactly does it mean to have a phenomenological analysis of voice and experience. So that is the thing of teaching. I also teach piano using the visual method from the DLGPM with all the different patterns. So anyone want to see that, dlgpm.com, you're more than free to go do that. So those are things coming up.
Well, you heard it here, kids. It's phenomenological examination of the voice, of interaction and knowing things and meaning. It sounds like it's going to be a pretty transformative course.
Absolutely. You're going to be Optimus Prime by the end of it. It's going to really work out. So It's all going to work out. So we have that, and
Oh,
then the
I don't know. I
wonderful.
think I have a soft spot for Decepticons.
I was about to
Soundwave
say
and
Starscream.
Megatron.
Soundwave, that's it. That's exactly what I was going to say. When I was a kid, and Soundwave, he would turn into the gun that Megatron would use in the animated movie. Dude, that animated movie from like '94 traumatized me. With Unicron, he would eat the planets and different things like
Yeah,
that.
the old animated movie.
The old one, that's right. From
Yeah,
like
that thing with the most awesome soundtrack ever made
you've got
to
the power. Dun dun, you got the spark. Oh yeah, dude, 80s music was the place to go.
and
So
that
no,
it just to comment very quickly on that, because since you brought it up, it's so weird because that movie was purpose made to be just a giant commercial for
yes,
these toys,
toys, Hasbro and all that.
uh, and yet they managed to elicit so much passion and deep experiences in this kids movie, because basically it's a war movie, right?
Oh yeah. Oh
it's
yeah.
it's a generation of people, leaders that are inspiring. They all get wiped out, and it's the younger generation taking over. They don't have the foggiest clue of what's going on, and was like, wow, they're not, and they're not joking around when they're killing the old
Optimus
characters,
right at
right?
the start.
It's
That's
just like all of them. It's like it's so brutal, and this is a kids movie.
So that movie was on every afternoon for many years. Upstairs with the VCS on the TV from the farmhouse. It was the only one that worked. And you're watching this movie, and in the first 15 minutes, the freaking Decepticons attack the Megas. Wait a minute, the final battle is happening in the first 15 minutes, and he killed Optimus Prime in the first 20 minutes. It's like just a minute. Like it truly is extraordinary. And then there's a giant thing that eats planets called Unicron. Yeah, no, that movie don't play around. Like Hasbro, if all commercials were like that for kids' toys, I tell you what, we'd be giving the Oscars out to different things. The Oscars would go to different things.
But in a weird way, this sort of the commercial purpose of like, oh yes, we need to get rid of this line of toys and introduce this line of toys. So all these corporate pragmatic commercial interests were just stuffed in there, and the creators and the animators and the people in the creative team, they managed to whip out through it, despite all those things, this amazing thing, right? And nowadays it feels like the reverse.
Yeah, maybe that's where so maybe the problem today is that they're not trying to make commercials when they do movies. And maybe it's the second order effect where you get masterpieces, and now they're like doing it. Because it's the same with that G.I. Joe cartoon. That old classic G.I. Joe cartoon, that did not mess a frick around. And they're just trying to sell toys. And you're like, my gosh. Like, people are all worried about the stuff that's on TV. It's like, man, when I was 6, I was watching Optimus Prime get dropped. I was watching Cobra Commander get turned into a snake and some sort of weird monster machine. Like, that's what my 6-year-old was like. I think that's what it was like for me. These kids today, they got it easy.
Yeah. Today, no characters die. They just keep resurrecting them, bringing them back.
Die. Yeah. They get like 5 sequels. Like, if they die, they just make a sequel. Like, they literally don't die. Like, when they're at the age where they should be dead, they reboot it. So you always avoid death. So there's no Heidegger, there's no being, there's no valley of ontology.
There's no being towards death.
No, it's all crap in different things. But no, so we have the phenomenology. The great, I love Cadell, and we work together, and we have the science of logic coming up, which you mentioned that earlier. So I have it on my bedstand, and it's got all the sticky notes of the sections I need to review, and I just kind of shudder, and I'm like, oh gosh, at least I have till January. So we have that with Cadell, the pattern, and we also do different things in creative writing on how to, like, short stories or different things that are a lot of fun to work on and teach, like different groups and different things. So we enjoy that. Which it's always fun. There's a great, just as a little note for that, anyone who is interested in writing fiction, particularly, there's a book called From Where Dreams Come by Robert Olson, and he won the Nobel Prize. And I think it's a true masterpiece. And actually, it was horrible when I read it, because I realized I had to rewrite everything because it was all crap after I read that book. But that's a wonderful text that actually, I have a paper and I haven't edited on how I actually think, because we were talking about this earlier, how it actually is good for philosophy as well, to truly think in terms of writing a creative story. And to actually, because like, for example, he makes the point where he says, a lot of times when you think, you'll tell people, you'll say the character was in the living room next to the bookcase, and he'll just smack you. He'll be like, nobody experiences bookcase. Describe it. And the radical level of description that he's kind of pointing out you need to do to make a actual story flow and operate and emotionally connect, for me, was a really big deal. And it actually then speaks to the kind of role of phenomenology in philosophy. So Robert Olson's book, From Where Dreams Come, is really big if anyone's interested in that.
When you said nobody experiences bookcase, my thoughts went to like, holy shit, that's right. Nobody has written about the experience of the bookcase. How is it to be a bookcase? Right? You start out all empty. You're like this tabula rasa, and then people put stuff into you. Yeah, and then things get switched out. Like, are you the same bookcase? Are you now a different bookcase? Are you the sum of the collections of your books, or what's going on there? Right.
So, sure. So your next poetry class, The Bookcase by Dr. Philippe Nicholas.
Yeah.
But I will say, a question I didn't quite answer, kind of answered on who is Daniel Garner. I have no idea. But one of the things, too, that was actually formative in addition to creative writing, I did sign language for 2 years. As you know, I was actually hoping to be a translator, but then UVA canceled the program at the last minute, so that was sad. And there was something also about the experience of language in such a pictorial and performative form that actually was very profound on me and had a big impact on philosophical thinking. Because, I read, I was reading Derrida on grammatology, and there's so much about the divide between the signifier and the signified. And don't get me wrong, you can argue, he argues ultimately that there's still a divide between presence and whatever. But language in the terms of sign language, I actually think sign language is philosophically very rich, experientially, and the implications of it. So that was another thing, creative writing and sign language. And photography, I did that. I ran a photography business for a number of years when I was 15, Frozen Glory photography. I also found photography was a fascinating undertaking. In addition to where it justified getting lost in the mountains for 5 hours, I could say it was part of work as opposed to me being lost. So it was a nice rationalization I could engage in as well.
Well, there are tons of divides all around us, right? I am not this table before me, and that's a good thing, I think. But ultimately, there isn't a divide. I think that's where at the metaphysical level, when we make claims to what is reality, what is the world as such, what is actuality, what is real, better not be any divisions there.
Absolutely.
All right. Anything else you want to add, Daniel?
Michelle and I's wedding marital counseling business will be starting next week, and you can even join our venue after you're ready to go. No, I'm joking. So different thing. But no, Dr. Philippe Nicholas, I always enjoy
you're announcing a kind of a subscription form from your business. It's going to be called OG Rose Plus.
Well, the Netflix Hulu package will be free. That will be included. So don't even worry. You'll be able to get by in your marital bliss. But no. I always really appreciate speaking with you. It's truly a joy. So I appreciate your time, and thank you for the work that you do. Like I've mentioned before, the work that you put out is golden. So thank you for the time that you put to make it possible and to share it with other people. So I'm always grateful to have these opportunities. So thank you, Philippe.
Well, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for sharing your time with me and the viewers here. Kids, you heard it here. If you're interested in more of what Daniel is up to, his teaching, his writing, and the writing of him and his wife's project, the OG Rose, I'll post a bunch of links down below, and head on over to his channel, or the Instagram. There's lots of, you guys keep on posting lots of stuff, and I think it's maybe a way to describe it would be like, you guys are a form of life, right? And you're giving us a candidate of what a good form of life could be like. And so watching your videos, reading your stuff, following your Instagram, just doing the small things, just like following Instagram, gets people in the loop of this hurricane that is OG Rose, right? And I think little by little you'll transform people.
Well, thank you, Dr.
And you won't know it until it's happened.
There you go.
Right.
So, there you go. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it very much.
And with that, I'll just like to say, transform and roll out.
Roll out. Thank you, Philippe. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.